Welcome back to our third discussion board. This week we're going to be talking about Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and also talking about nonsense literature. For this discussion board, we're going to talk a little bit about the historical reading of Alice and also the features that are usually found in nonsense literature. So let's first talk a little bit about our author, Lewis Carroll, who his actual birth name was Charles L. Dodson, but his pen name was Lewis Carroll. And this was partly because Dodson was actually a mathematician, and he was actually a lecturer at Christ College. And he served as a lecturer for a mathematician, but he was also an avid photographer and wrote essays and political pamphlets and poetry. So using this pen name, he kind of separated himself from the academic of Charles L. Dodson and then the more nonsensical author Lewis Carroll. So I want to talk a little bit more about the specific inspiration for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which was inspired by a little girl actually named Alice. In 1856 that is, Dodson became really close to a family that was at Christ College and particularly gained an interest in the three youngest girls of that family, Lorena, Edith, and Alice. And during an afternoon adventure with these three girls, Carroll told the first iteration of what would later become Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and supposedly the actual Alice asked Carroll to write this down for her. Now I want to look a little bit more closely at the actual text of Alice. And so here are some biographical aspects that we can find in the text. This little short blurb can also be found on a handout that is linked below this video. I hope that you go ahead and either open that link right now to that document or open it up before you post to the discussion board and make sure that you either save that or print it out and keep it with your notes, because those are things that I do expect that you know after we go through this. Okay, so here are some biographical aspects that we can find in the text. The opening poem, All in a Golden Afternoon, references Prima, Secunda, and Tertia, and so those are specific references to the three girls. And then Alice in the text mentions her cat Dinah, and that was the real Alice's real cat's name. And then the characters in the Pool of Tears scene are modeled after friends who attended the boating party on July 4th, 1862. So Dodson, Duckworth, Lorena, Alice, and Edith. And then the Dormouse's tale features three little sisters, Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly. And you can see that those names are reflected in what the little girls' actual names are as well. So I want to talk a little bit more about historically what was going on for children at this time in Victorian era England, and specifically the educational opportunities that were available for girls. In the upper classes, it was assumed that a girl would marry and didn't really have any need for a formal education. And you may have picked up that that was the case for the Little family. So they were expected to instead know how to play piano, to sing, to be able to recite poems, to be able to arrange flowers. Those things were really considered to be important skills for them to know. From a very early age, the girls, Alice and her two sisters, were encouraged to attend events at Oxford with their parents and learn how to mingle and converse with these guests that were attending these events. And specifically, their mother was really anxious that her daughters make good marriages, and so the training in social skills could not begin soon enough. So I want you to take this into account when you're thinking about the discussion questions later on, and really thinking about how nonsense literature kind of butts up against this expectation of girls and young women to be very prim and proper and know how to deal with all sorts of people and to have really graceful social skills. So now let's talk a little bit more about the features of nonsense literature and nonsense literature as a genre. Typically, nonsense literature is seen as subversive and humorous, and it's most notably developed in the Victorian era by writers such as Lewis Carroll and Edward Beard. And then, of course, you may have known some of these other names, Roald Dahl, Shaw Silverstein, and Louis Sachar, who we're reading for later on this week. And then there's three big elements that I want you to be able to know. The first is senselessness. So situations may be implausible, everyday common sense may be totally abandoned. The second one is linguistic wordplay. So language used in humorous, creative ways, sometimes to produce sounds rather than sense, or to encourage oral performance or someone speaking the text aloud. So all of the following can be found in nonsense literature, and many of these are found within our text today. So the first one being puns, words with multiple possible meanings. The next one is malapropism, which I love very much. And so they're words that sound like but are not appropriate words in a context. So for example, what are you incinerating, when one actually means what are you insinuating. Another is riddles, invented words, and various other forms of wordplay. And the third, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on in our fourth discussion board, is irreverence for authority or established power structures. So this, like I said, nonsense literature is really subversive. So it may parody or challenge accepted social conventions of a specific era when it is produced. It might mock authority figures and model or encourage disrespectful behavior. So as a note, these three aspects of nonsense literature are something that you should really keep in mind and be able to know. And like I said, the handout, which this is on, I would highly recommend that you either download or print it out so that you have it with you, especially so you can study it once we get to our midterm time. So let's look a little bit more closely at wordplay that's going on in Alice. And these are just some examples that I picked out, but there are quite a few more in the text, and I hope that you go and look for a few more on your own as well. So for the first one, we've got puns, and as the mouse explains, this is the driest thing I know. And in that moment, they're talking about being dried off because they're wet, but he tells a tale that is very dry, and he means boring. And then we have a malapropism with reeling and writhing. When the mock turtle says this, and he is of course meaning reading and writing. Then we have quite a few different riddles, but one is why is a raven like a writing desk? Ask the Mad Hatter. Parodies, Twinkle Twinkle Little Bat, and I'm sure that you know Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And there's also a really interest in language and meaning throughout the text. So, for example, the March Hare tells Alice to take some more tea, but she says that she's had nothing yet, and she replies in an offended tone, so I can't take more. So we have this moment where Alice feels as though she's been offended because she hasn't been offered anything, and these social cues of, if she hasn't been offered anything, then she can't take more either. So we have 4 different discussion questions that you can respond to this time around, and you only need to respond to one, so choose whichever one you would like. And I'm not going to read them all to you, but really it's talking about, all of these really focus on our text, but also how the historical and biographical aspects influence that text, and also how the text aligns with nonsense literature. So make sure you pick one and thoroughly explain your answers and use textual evidence. Make sure that you're reading the question specifically and making sure that you're answering all parts of the question and using as much textual evidence as the question asks you to use for this one.